Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Q&A on the Tribune's lawsuit against the city of Paso Robles and Councilman Chris Bausch. We're coming to you from the Tribune's newsroom in downtown SLO. This lawsuit is the culmination of 6 months of investigative reporting by Chloe Jones and Sadie Dittenberg that included 19 Public Records Act requests. The goal was to unravel the true story behind former city manager Ty Lewis's allegations of a conspiracy against him led by Bausch and Calco's news reporter Karen Veely. After prying out all the information we could and writing at least 20 stories, however, we are still missing key communications we hope will explain what happened. These are texts and emails relating to the public's business, but held on Chris Bausch's personal devices. Despite being at the center of this controversy, Bausch has turned over almost nothing of significance that would explain his role. For its part, the city spent months handling each of our requests, searching for responsive records, making a lot of redactions, and turning over what it believed applied. Throughout, the city repeatedly asked Bausch to turn over records or make his devices available for their review, to no avail. He has said he was working on it, but that it would take him 6 months. Then he said he wouldn't turn over anything unless ordered by a court. With no other options, the Tribune and its attorney, Carl Olson, filed a lawsuit last week seeking to force Bausch to reveal the public records held on his devices as required by state law, which explicitly bars public officials from hiding public communications on their personal devices. The requirement is so rock solid, it was upheld by the California Supreme Court in a unanimous 2017 verdict that was argued and won by Carl himself. Today, we're going to further explain why this case is so important and why we took the extraordinary step of filing a lawsuit. We're recording this session, so you'll be able to rewatch and share. We'll run through the key questions, but if you have any that you'd like to ask, you can do that in the chat, and we'll get to those at the end. So we're going to start with Chloe and Sadie. You filed 19 Public Records Act requests. What records did you receive, and what are you still trying to get?
Yeah, so we originally received the original claim filed by Ty Lewis against the city, which was a $2.2 million claim. And in that claim form, he alleged that Mr. Bausch had harassed him to the point that he experienced medical complications, and that's why he ultimately went out on medical leave last fall. In addition to that, we received an addendum document to the claim form that further outlines some allegations. We also received related emails and other documents, and then we have requested the texts and emails from council members' personal devices. And all of the council members have turned those over so far, with the exception of Mr. Bausch. And the other council members and the mayor also signed affidavits testifying that they did turn over everything that they had, with the exception of Mr. Bausch.
Thanks. Has either of you ever reported a story like this, and what was it like?
The case that comes to mind to me is when we filed a motion to unseal court records in the Kristen Smart case in 2022. In that instance, the court was erroneously sealing records, hundreds of records throughout this case, and shielding them from the public. So we filed a motion to unseal them, which ended up being very successful, and we unsealed all the hundreds of documents and were able to report on them. I will say I haven't experienced a case where it appears that a city councilman is explicitly violating the state law, or a case where it appears that the city and a city councilman have different interpretations of how to follow that law. So that is a new one for me.
Okay, next up, we want to jump over to Carl. Carl, tell us what the law requires here. Why do you believe Bausch should turn over records from his private devices?
Because the Supreme Court in the 2017 unanimous decision said that even if you're using a so-called personal device, if you're doing public business, you got to turn the records over. The key is, are you doing public business? If you are, you got to turn the records over. It doesn't matter whether you're using a government-issued electronic device or a so-called personal device. And in that case, it's interesting because the city of San Jose, which was the defendant in that lawsuit, took the extreme position that if you're using your personal phone to conduct business, then that's the end of the story. Nobody gets to see anything because I was using my personal device. And the Supreme Court just categorically rejected that and said 7-0 that it's when you're doing public business, the records have to be turned over. And that's not a brand new decision now. That's 8 years old. Came down on March 2nd of 2017. But there are public officials, and I think Mr. Bausch has been one of them, who just kind of take the position that, if I'm using my personal device, I don't have to take it over. Now, after we filed the lawsuit, I think maybe there's some sign that he's willing to turn stuff over now. But that has happened only as a result of the filing of the lawsuit. It was the city that had said that that Mr. Bausch had said that he wouldn't turn over anything. He wouldn't even search without a court order. So if the city's right, then he was taken an extreme position, and was, in our view, defying the law and the San Jose case. Now, again, he seems to be taking the position now that's more cooperative. And that new stance, if it is a new stance, happened only after we filed the lawsuit, a lawsuit that, after the city said it's going to take a court order to get him to search, we felt like we absolutely had to file this lawsuit.
Thanks. Let's talk a little bit more about that. With that case, you have some substantial experience in this area. How strong do you think this case is?
We think it's a strong case, or we wouldn't have filed it. Nobody wants to file a case that they're not going to win. So we feel we have a very strong case. And the preamble to the Public Records Act says access to records is a fundamental and necessary right to the functioning of a democracy. That's pretty strong language. And when it went to the voters in 2004, whether to make that a constitutional right, 83% of the voters said, yeah, that should be a constitutional right of access. You can't get 83% of the people to agree on anything except maybe motherhood and apple pie. But it's a constitutional right, and somebody's got to put teeth into it. And if newspapers don't do it, nobody is going to do it. Government, they want everything to be secret. They pay lip service a lot to transparency. But, I always say that anytime somebody that's running for public office says, I believe in transparency, grab your wallet.
Thanks, Carl. Let's jump back to Chloe and Sadie. What do you most enjoy about reporting a story like this, and what is most challenging?
I really enjoy being able to slowly put puzzle pieces together to figure out the truth behind what happened. So each document reveals a new anecdote or a new lead as to what the truth is behind Ty Lewis's claim, and the allegations that were in there. And so I think figuring that out is really exciting. But something that is frustrating and is challenging is when we are getting stonewalled to really figure out, because that, like Joe said, those key communications are held on Chris Bausch's phone. And right now we're being stonewalled on being able to get those so that we can really figure out what's going on.
Yeah, I agree with what Chloe said. I also would add that I think one of the best parts of this job for me is just being able to hold public officials accountable, especially when they're responsible for taxpayers' dollars. And so I think that doing this kind of work is really key in making that happen and making sure that we are holding our elected officials accountable. As far as what I don't like, I wish that we never had to sue anyone. I wish that we didn't have to take legal action against a city and a council member. But unfortunately, that just isn't always the case.
Thanks. What would you say your ultimate goal is in reporting this story?
I would say our ultimate goal is just to uncover what's been happening as much as we can. And the PRA is definitely the best tool that we have to be able to do that. We want to know what's been happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, to reiterate what Sadie said, the Public Records Act really exists to give transparency in our public business when government officials are refusing to or declining to. And so this Public Records Act is there when, like Carl said, when public officials are doing lip service about transparency, but not really walking the walk when it comes to that. And so our goal is to really figure out the truth with documents, not with just people making up whatever they're going to make up.
Great, thanks. Let's jump back to Carl for some more questions. Carl, what happens next and how do you see this unfolding?
Well, there will be a hearing on the merits of our Public Records Act petition, and before that, I think we're going to seek the deposition of Mr. Bausch. A deposition it doesn't happen in court, but the witness is under oath. So we think that given that the city has said that he took the position that he wouldn't take any action to turn over records or even search without a court order, we feel that it's essential to get sworn testimony from him, a deposition where the witness can be cross-examined, and we think that he should also be required to provide sworn written testimony. But a deposition is better because, then you can actually cross-examine the person and not just have to take at face value the word of one of the defendants.
Great. Another question. What should cities do to ensure they are following state law regarding public records on private devices?
They should be required to adopt policies that a public official either use a government device that can be searched by the city or copy a government device, even if they happen to use their private phone when they're doing public business. But I think cities have to proactively follow the guidance of the Supreme Court, which said you should use or copy a government device. And that's federal law. In fact, one of the reasons that the 2016 election at the national level may have gone in Mr. Trump's favor was because Hillary Clinton was accused of using her private electronic device to conduct public business. So I have to say, it's not just good policy for somebody to use the government device, it's actually good politics. Because if you don't, people are going to think that you're trying to hide something. You know, the old saying, the cover up is always worse than the crime. But, it's really essential. I mean, you had in LA that new mayor, Karen Bass, was doing a lot of texting and stuff about public business on her phone, and somehow it disappeared. And in San Francisco, the previous mayor, London Breed, who was just voted out of office amid numerous scandals, she did a lot of her business on her so-called private phone. And when somebody asked for it, they never turned it over. So, in fairness to Mr. Bausch, he's not the only one doing this, but that doesn't make it right. There's a constitutional right of access to communications dealing with public business.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, from what you're saying there, it sounds like obviously what the case in Paso is not just a one-off, and we have some other examples there. But how prevalent do you think this problem is throughout California?
I think it's becoming, or has become, depressingly common. There was a mayor in Stockton who used his private phone, and even after a lawsuit was filed, he resisted turning it over, and finally a judge ordered him to turn stuff over. And there seems to be, I guess this gets back to what I said about it's good politics, which is something that government officials ought to listen to turn stuff over. Don't try to hide stuff. All these people that were doing business on so-called private electronic devices, they ended up getting defeated. Former Mayor Michael Tubbs of Stockton, former Mayor Sam Liccardo of San Jose, which is the largest city in Northern California. Of course, he's now a congressman. So, but that's because he had more name recognition than the people he was running against. But if you're saying you got nothing to hide and you believe in transparency, walk the walk. Don't just talk the talk.
Thanks, Carl. Let's jump back for a few more questions for Chloe and Sadie, and then we have some questions we're receiving from viewers, so we'll get into those. Chloe and Sadie, some of the feedback we've heard in covering this story over the last several months, leading up to basically Ty Lewis's retirement resignation. The question is, Ty Lewis is gone. He quit. Why is this still a story?
Well, I do want to note that a lot of these public records requests public records requests that we filed occurred long before Ty Lewis ever left. And so we weren't able to figure out what was going on because Bausch, we believe, was stonewalling and violating the law and not releasing these public records. And when a public official is not following the law in order to not be transparent about things that are going on, especially something like the city manager alleging that a city councilman is creating such a hostile work environment that he has to go on medical leave, then I think that's important for the public to know and for the government to be transparent about. And I think that we all want to know how our government officials are acting behind closed doors on our behalf.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the community of Paso Robles has a right to know what has been happening. And just because Lewis retired and settled with the city doesn't mean that that story is over.
Great. Another question, we can get on stories like this is, why is the Tribune devoting, resources to this when they could be telling other stories? And why also, are we forcing the city to do the same?
I mean, we all hope that our public officials follow the law and are transparent and don't violate the Public Records Act. And so
I think that's important to note. I think it's reasonable for any average citizen to want their government officials to follow the law, and when they're not, then that's something that needs to be held, that official needs to be held accountable for.
Yeah, and with the city saying that Bausch has refused to comply with the PRA, ultimately we were kind of forced into this. Again, we don't want to be going around suing cities, but we are going to use our resources when we feel that the times call for it.
Great, thanks. One more question. We've talked a little bit about, Carl's mentioned about other cases involving this in bigger cities and elsewhere around California. What do you know about other cities in San Luis Obispo County? Do we know anything about what they're doing?
Yeah, so we've reached out to several cities. I believe we are still waiting to hear back from the county and Atascadero. But what I can say is that the majority of the cities don't have a written policy regarding how government officials or government employees should be using private devices. I will say Grover Beach Police Department does have a policy where they discourage the use of using private devices for work business, except for in extreme circumstances. The city of SLO does not require that records are copied on government devices necessarily, but they do make it explicit that any public business done on a cellular or a private device is subject to the Public Records Act and is also therefore subject to their retention policy. Pismo Beach does not have a specific policy, but they told us that they do their best to follow the law, especially regarding City versus San Jose with private devices, and make sure when they're fulfilling Public Records Act requests that they're addressing those private devices. And then the same thing for Arroyo Grande, who told us that they also don't have a written policy, but they follow the guidelines under the San Jose decision.
And again, we are waiting to hear back from a couple agencies, but I also reached out to Morro Bay, and they do have some guidelines written in policy, which includes that limited use of personal devices is permitted, but it's ultimately discouraged, and they're encouraged to copy their government devices when using their personal phones. And they're also notified that any public business that is conducted on a private device is eligible to be requested under the PRA.
So that sounds like another story that you guys are working on. So is that the case?
Yes.
Great, thanks. So that's the questions we had for Carl, Sadie, and Chloe for right now. So let's jump over to some of the questions that are coming in from viewers today. Here's one, and this one I think should go to Carl. Carl, when will the filed lawsuit go before a judge, and would it be in Paso?
It will be in Paso, and we had a call among the city and the Tribune and Mr. Bosch, who's representing himself this morning, about things like scheduling. So the judge, of course, will decide when to schedule the hearing. We said at the earliest possible time. The city took the position September, and Mr. Bosch, I think, was saying something like July. But it's important to note that part of the Public Records Act is a provision that says hearings should be set at the earliest possible time. There's a need for speed. And of course, a judge is going to make that decision. And, obviously the court has discretion in that, but there is the statutory provision that says that hearings should be set at the earliest possible time.
Thanks. Got another question here that's probably suited for you best. Who will foot the bill in the result of a successful lawsuit? Will Chris Bausch personally or the city?
We are seeking recovery of fees jointly and severally from both the city and Mr. Bosch. normally it comes from the public agency. But in this kind of unique situation where the city is blaming one of their own council members for the problem, and Mr. Bosch is, I think, blaming the city for not being clear enough in what he was supposed to do. We are seeking fees jointly and severally from both. So if we get a, you know, $10 fee award, and obviously it's going to be a hell of a lot more than that, we're taking the position that both the city and Mr. Bosch would be liable for the whole thing.
Can you explain what jointly and severally means?
It means that they're both obligated for the whole thing. You don't get paid twice. I mean, if the city paid for the whole thing, Mr. Bosch wouldn't have to pay. But if the city tried to blame it all on him, we're taking the position that the city is responsible too, because they could have done a lot more in avoiding this problem. They don't have a policy, and there are a lot of public agencies, like Chloe and Sadie were saying, that despite a decision, unanimous decision from the Supreme Court 8 years ago that said that cities should adopt a use or copy policy, there hasn't exactly been enthusiastic embrace of what the Supreme Court said. In fact, it's been closer to open defiance from a lot of agencies. And these are the same agencies that banded together before the Supreme Court to say, none of this should be public. If it's on a private phone, you don't have to disclose anything. And they used public money to tell the Supreme Court that. And they lost the case, and they're still basically not following what the Supreme Court said. It's very sad, very, very sad. I wrote an op-ed piece, which McClatchy newspapers published this week. It's National Sunshine Week, saying that there's not much sunshine from Washington to Sacramento to San Luis Obispo. On the national level, Donald Trump is no friend of the press. Obviously, he blames the press on everything because occasionally they do stories that don't make them look good. And, public officials from Washington to California, no matter what party they're in, they feel like the only stories that should be published are the ones that make me look good. Nobody should ever publish a story that's embarrassing to me. There's no exemption under the Public Records Act for disclosure of records that might embarrass a public official or make him or her look bad. Because if there was, then the villains all over the place, nothing would ever be disclosed. Because, gee, the records would make them look bad. They would expose corruption, incompetence, inefficiency, prejudice, and favoritism, the very words the Supreme Court used in the San Jose case. We got to be able to hold public officials and politicians accountable. And if they can't stand the heat, they shouldn't have gotten into the kitchen. Harry Truman, of course, said that.
Thanks, Carl. Well said on all those. We got a couple more questions here. If anybody has some other questions they want to ask, toss them in the chat right now so we can get them. This one we'll kick back to Sadie and Chloe. What about other members of the city council and the city staff? Have they complied with requests?
So every other member of the city council has signed affidavits under the penalty of perjury that they've produced all the records that they have on their personal devices, and that they've done an adequate search for those records on their personal devices. The only city council member that has not signed an affidavit under the penalty of perjury is Chris Bausch.
Okay, we have one more question here. Then we'll maybe wrap up after this one. This one I think probably should go back to Carl. Carl, what are the potential punishments or consequences for this behavior? Is recall the only process?
Well, if we recover fees, we're obviously going to ask for fees, as I was just saying, from both the city and from Mr. Bosch. And I think it would be entirely appropriate for both of them to be responsible for the fees, because I really think that a lot of politicians, if they don't have to pay for it personally, they say, oh, well, it's somebody else's money, even though they're on this city council and their job is to make sure that public money is spent wisely. So, there have to be consequences, and attorney's fees are one of them. We also feel like the council could have censured Mr. Bosch. They still could. That's something that, a censure like that, one of the main consequences is that it might or might not end his political career. Like Mayor Liccardo in San Jose, even though he lost 2 cases and he got a lot of bad publicity when he ran for Congress after being termed out as mayor, he got elected to Congress. Like I say, we don't know if that's because people thought he was a good guy or that he was well funded, partly from people that had business with the city, and he had name recognition. Maybe some people were thinking, better the devil I know than the devil I don't know. But that's a political issue. And, one of the reasons for the Public Records Act and for these consequences and the fundamental and necessary right is to ensure that people are held accountable, and so that the public knows whether they're behaving well or behaving badly. The public has to be able to know that. And, you can't just take a politician's word for things like, I believe in transparency and I'm going to save taxpayer dollars, So that's why we're here.
Thanks. I have a follow-up on that. Say the Tribune wins this case, and Bausch has to turn over, the records from private devices. How will you know that you got everything that was there, or if something was destroyed?
You don't necessarily know that, and that's why one of the reasons why we feel it's essential to have his deposition taken so that he can be cross-examined. And and that's again one of the reasons why you don't want people using their private phone, especially if they don't copy the government, because you never know what you don't know. And until you get the records that answer the questions in the Public Records Act request, you don't know whether you've gotten all the records that you asked for, and you don't know whether they're hiding something.
Thanks so much, Carl. That's all the questions that we had. I just wanted to give everyone one last chance for some concluding thoughts. So kick it back over to Chloe and Sadie.
I just want to say that I feel really proud to be a part of the Tribune and a part of a news organization that cares so much about transparency and it cares about holding our public officials accountable when they're declining to follow the law and declining to be transparent. We have a really great team and we work really hard, and I feel proud of the work that we're doing, and I feel proud to continue doing that work.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And I also just think that as this issue, as personal cell phones and personal devices and social media become more prevalent and mainstream, that this issue is continuing to get bigger. And so I think that just encouraging cities and local agencies to review their policies and make sure that they understand the PRA is very, very critical.
Thanks so much. Carl, any final thoughts?
Here, here. Like they said.
Okay. I think that about does it for today. I want to thank everyone for attending and listening. Thank Chloe, Sadie, and Carl for participating here. Really appreciate that. Really appreciate everyone who's supporting ethical local journalism in San Luis Obispo County. Like I said, this Q&A was recorded, so it'll be on our website and available if you want to review it or if you want to share it. And with that, just again, thanks so much for your support and have a great day.